In the early years of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean became one of the most critical battlefields on Earth. Every day, long lines of merchant ships crossed these waters, carrying fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and food from North America to Britain. These convoys formed the lifeline that allowed Allied nations to continue fighting. Without those shipments, factories would slow, armies would struggle to operate, and entire military campaigns could collapse. For Germany's naval command, interrupting this flow of supplies became a strategic priority. German submarines, known as U-boats, were designed specifically for this task. Instead of engaging enemy fleets in open naval battles, they operated quietly across shipping routes, searching for convoys that crossed the Atlantic. A submarine could patrol enormous stretches of ocean while remaining hidden beneath the surface. Once a convoy was detected, the submarine could follow it silently, waiting for the right moment to attack. The Atlantic itself helped make these operations possible. It was one of the largest oceans in the world, stretching thousands of miles between continents. Patrol areas were enormous, and no navy could watch every section of water at the same time. For submarine commanders, this vastness created a powerful advantage. Somewhere across that ocean, there was always room to hide. Submarines used this advantage carefully. During daylight hours, they often remained submerged, listening for distant ship engines and observing through periscopes. At night, they could surface to recharge their batteries and move quickly across the water. In darkness, a surfaced submarine could approach a convoy with far less risk of being detected. From there, torpedoes could be launched at merchant ships before the submarines slipped away beneath the waves again. As these attacks increased, German commanders began to organize submarines into coordinated groups. When one submarine discovered a convoy, it could report the position to other submarines nearby. Soon, several submarines might converge on the same group of ships, preparing attacks from multiple directions. These operations allowed submarines to overwhelm convoy defenses and strike several targets in a single night. From the perspective of U-boat crews, the Atlantic seemed almost perfectly suited to submarine warfare. The shipping lanes were busy, the ocean was enormous, and the convoys had to cross those waters no matter how dangerous the journey became. Escort ships could defend the merchant vessels to some degree, but they could not watch the entire ocean surrounding them. For a time, this balance favored the submarines. Across the Atlantic, German U-boats struck convoys again and again, damaging the supply routes that Allied forces depended on. It appeared that the ocean itself had become an ally to the submarine fleet. But that advantage would not last forever. During the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic, German submarines gained a reputation as one of the most dangerous threats facing Allied shipping. The strategy behind their operations was simple, but highly effective. Instead of trying to defeat large naval fleets, the German Navy focused on attacking merchant vessels carrying supplies across the ocean. These cargo ships were essential for maintaining the Allied war effort, and every ship that failed to reach its destination weakened the flow of resources needed to sustain military operations. Submarines were particularly well suited for this mission. Unlike surface warships, which could be seen from miles away, submarines could travel beneath the surface of the water and remain hidden while observing enemy ships. The submarine commander could watch a convoy from a distance using a periscope, study its formation, and choose the best moment to attack. Once torpedoes were launched, the submarine could dive deeper and escape while escort ships attempted to locate the attacker. One of the most effective tactics developed during this period was the wolfpack strategy. When a submarine discovered a convoy crossing the Atlantic, the commander would transmit its position back to German Naval Command. Other submarines operating in the region would then move toward that location. Instead of a single submarine attacking alone, several submarines could surround the convoy and coordinate their attacks. This tactic created confusion among escort ships and increased the chances of multiple successful torpedo strikes. Night operations also played a crucial role in these attacks. Submarines could travel faster on the surface than when submerged, and the darkness made it more difficult for convoy escorts to detect them. A surfaced submarine could maneuver between the columns of merchant ships, launch torpedoes, and then dive beneath the waves before escorts could respond effectively. In many cases, convoy escorts were forced to react to several attacks at once, allowing other submarines to escape undetected. Another advantage for submarines was the limited range of Allied aircraft during the early part of the war. Aircraft were extremely effective at detecting submarines traveling on the surface, but most patrol planes operated from land bases and could only cover a certain distance over the ocean. Once convoys moved far enough from land, aircraft patrols disappeared, leaving submarines free to operate without constant aerial surveillance. These conditions allowed submarines to dominate large sections of the Atlantic shipping lanes. Convoys still attempted to defend themselves with escort ships and defensive formations, but the vast ocean and the stealth of submarines gave German commanders many opportunities to strike. For a time, the balance of the Atlantic campaign appeared to favor the submarine fleet. As the Battle of the Atlantic expanded, a large section of ocean began to play an especially important role in submarine operations. This area lay far from the coasts of Europe and North America, beyond the normal range of most Allied patrol aircraft. Ships crossing the ocean eventually entered this region during their journey, and once they did, air protection disappeared. Naval escorts still accompanied the convoys, but without aircraft overhead, a critical layer of defense was missing. This region became known as the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap. It was not defined by any official boundary, but by simple geography. Aircraft operating from airfields in Britain, Iceland, Greenland, or Canada could only fly a certain distance over open water before needing to return to base. The middle of the Atlantic therefore remained largely uncovered by air patrols. Convoys traveling through that zone were temporarily outside the reach of Allied aircraft. For submarine commanders, this gap was extremely valuable. Aircraft represented one of the greatest dangers to submarines operating on the surface. A plane flying overhead could quickly detect a submarine moving across the water and direct escort ships toward it. But inside the air gap, the chances of such encounters were greatly reduced. Submarine commanders knew that once convoys entered this part of the Atlantic, the risk of air attack dropped dramatically. Because of this advantage, German naval planners concentrated many of their submarine patrol areas around the shipping lanes that passed through the gap. When a convoy approached this region, the submarines already positioned in the area could begin tracking it. Additional submarines might be directed toward the convoy as part of coordinated wolfpack operations. With no aircraft overhead, submarines could maneuver more freely and maintain contact with the convoy for longer periods. The lack of air coverage also affected how submarines approached their targets. Without the constant threat of aircraft, submarines could remain on the surface for longer periods, especially during night operations. This allowed them to travel faster and conserve battery power that would otherwise be used while submerged. Surface movement also made it easier for submarines to position themselves ahead of a convoy before launching attacks. For several years, this situation created a dangerous environment for Allied shipping. The convoys entering the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap were moving through the very region where submarines had the greatest operational freedom. Escorts could defend against attacks to some extent, but without aircraft to patrol the surrounding ocean, submarines still had significant room to operate. The Atlantic was vast, and for a time, this central zone of ocean remained one of the safest hunting grounds for the submarine fleet. To counter the growing submarine threat, Allied navies organized merchant ships into convoys that traveled together under the protection of escort vessels. Instead of individual cargo ships crossing the ocean alone, dozens of vessels would sail in formation, guarded by destroyers, corvettes, and other escort ships equipped to detect and attack submarines. This system made it harder for submarines to approach without being noticed and allowed escorts to respond quickly when attacks occurred. Escort ships carried several important tools designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. One of the most significant was sonar, known during the war as ASDIC. This system allowed escort vessels to send sound waves into the water and listen for the echoes returning from submerged objects. If a submarine was detected beneath the surface, the escort ship could attempt to track its movement and launch an attack. The primary weapon used against submerged submarines was the depth charge. These explosive devices were dropped into the water and set to detonate at a specific depth. When a submarine was located, escort ships would release multiple depth charges in the area where the submarine was believed to be hiding. The explosions created powerful shockwaves underwater that could damage a submarine's hull, disrupt equipment, or force the submarine to surface. Despite these defensive measures, protecting a convoy across thousands of miles of ocean was extremely difficult. A convoy might include 30 or 40 merchant ships spread across several columns, while only a handful of escort ships guarded the formation. Even with sonar and depth charges, the escort vessels had to divide their attention across a wide area. Submarines could still approach from different directions, searching for weaknesses in the defensive screen. Night conditions made the problem even more complicated. Submarines often attacked after dark, when visibility was limited and escort ships struggled to detect targets on the surface. A surface submarine could move quickly and position itself among the convoy columns before launching torpedoes. Once the attack began, escorts were forced to react immediately, but by that time, several ships might already have been hit. Another challenge for escort ships was maintaining contact with a submarine after an attack. When a submarine fired torpedoes and then submerged, tracking it became extremely difficult. Sonar could sometimes detect the submarine's position, but the target might change direction or dive deeper, making precise tracking unreliable. While escorts attempted to locate the submarine, other submarines operating nearby might prepare their own attacks. Because of these difficulties, convoy escorts often faced a constant struggle. They could defend the merchant ships and occasionally damage or drive off submarines, but they could not eliminate the threat entirely. The Atlantic remained a dangerous environment for convoys, and submarines continued to find opportunities to strike. It was clear that escort ships alone could not fully control such a vast battlefield. As submarine attacks continued to disrupt shipping across the Atlantic, Allied naval planners began to reconsider how the battle was being fought. Escort ships were essential for defending convoys, but the ocean was simply too large for surface vessels to monitor effectively on their own. Submarines could approach from many directions, and the mid-Atlantic air gap allowed them to operate without constant aerial surveillance. If the Allies wanted to protect their shipping lanes more effectively, they needed a way to observe much larger areas of ocean. Attention soon turned to air power. Aircraft had several advantages that surface ships did not. A patrol plane flying over the ocean could scan large stretches of water in a relatively short amount of time. From the air, it was often easier to spot a submarine moving across the surface, especially during daylight. Even a distant aircraft sighting could force a submarine to dive beneath the waves, interrupting its ability to track convoys or position itself for an attack. However, early in the war, most Allied aircraft were based on land airfields. This limited how far they could travel over the ocean before needing to return. As convoys moved farther into the Atlantic, the aircraft protecting them eventually had to turn back, leaving the ships outside the reach of aerial patrols. The mid-Atlantic air gap remained the same dangerous zone where submarines could operate with greater freedom. To overcome this limitation, Allied planners began developing new approaches that would extend air coverage across the ocean. One method involved improving long-range patrol aircraft, capable of flying much greater distances over water. These aircraft could remain airborne for extended periods and search wider patrol zones than earlier planes. The goal was to push aerial patrols farther into the Atlantic, gradually reducing the size of the air gap. Another solution involved placing aircraft directly at sea. Instead of relying entirely on land bases, small aircraft carriers were assigned to convoy protection duties. These escort carriers traveled with merchant convoys and carried groups of patrol aircraft on board. From these moving airfields, aircraft could launch patrols over the surrounding ocean, searching for submarines that might be tracking the convoy. This change introduced an entirely new dimension to the Atlantic campaign. Instead of relying only on sonar and surface escorts, convoys could now be supported by aircraft operating directly above them. The patrol planes could search ahead of the convoy, observe suspicious contacts, and quickly report submarine sightings to escort ships below. For submarine commanders, this development introduced a new threat that had not previously existed in many areas of the Atlantic. The ocean was still vast, but now aircraft were beginning to watch sections of water that had once been beyond their reach. The balance of the Atlantic battle was slowly beginning to change. As aircraft began operating more regularly over the Atlantic, the nature of submarine warfare started to change in ways that were immediately noticeable to submarine crews. Aircraft patrols could scan large sections of ocean far faster than any surface ship. A single patrol plane flying several hundred feet above the water could observe an area of ocean that would take multiple ships hours to search. This ability allowed Allied forces to begin monitoring the same vast waters that submarines had previously used as hiding places. Aircraft also had a clear advantage when submarines traveled on the surface. Submarines frequently surfaced to recharge batteries, communicate with command, or move quickly between patrol areas. While on the surface, a submarine's dark hull could often be spotted from the air, especially during daylight hours when visibility was clear. A patrol aircraft flying overhead could detect a submarine long before the submarine crew realized it had been seen. Once a submarine was detected, aircraft could react quickly. Patrol planes carried bombs, depth charges, and sometimes rockets designed specifically for attacking submarines. When an aircraft spotted a submarine on the surface, it could immediately begin an attack run, dropping explosives aimed at the submarine's hull or the water around it. Even if the attack did not destroy the submarine, it often forced the submarine to dive quickly beneath the surface to avoid further damage. Diving underwater protected the submarine from direct attack, but it also created serious limitations. Submerged submarines moved much more slowly than when they traveled on the surface. The battery power limited how long they could remain underwater, and visibility through periscopes was restricted. When forced to dive repeatedly because of aircraft sightings, submarines lost valuable time and had far fewer opportunities to position themselves near convoys. Aircraft also played an important role in guiding surface escorts towards submarine positions. If a patrol plane spotted a submarine or observed suspicious movement on the water, it could transmit the location to nearby escort ships. Destroyers and corvettes could then move toward that position and begin searching with sonar. This coordination between aircraft and surface ships made it much harder for submarines to remain undetected. For submarine commanders, the presence of aircraft introduced a new and unpredictable danger. A submarine traveling on the surface could suddenly find itself under attack with little warning. Even when submarines avoided direct damage, repeated aircraft patrols disrupted their ability to track convoys and plan coordinated attacks. The ocean, that once offered concealment, was gradually becoming a place where submarines could be spotted from above. As aircraft patrols expanded across the Atlantic, submarines began facing a situation very different from the one that existed earlier in the war. For years, submarine commanders had focused on tracking convoys and coordinating attacks with other submarines. Their mission was to hunt merchant ships and disrupt supply routes. But once aircraft began searching the ocean regularly, submarines increasingly found themselves on the defensive. Aircraft introduced speed and reach that submarines could not easily counter. A patrol plane could cross hundreds of miles of ocean in a single flight, searching for submarines that might be operating near shipping lanes. When a submarine was spotted on the surface, the aircraft could attack immediately or continue tracking it while calling nearby escort ships for support. This coordination meant that a submarine detected from the air might soon face both aerial attacks and approaching surface escorts. Radar technology made aircraft even more effective in these operations. Early in the war, submarines could sometimes avoid aircraft detection at night by remaining on the surface in darkness. However, radar allowed patrol aircraft to detect objects on the water, even when visibility was extremely poor. A submarine that surfaced after sunset to recharge batteries or travel quickly could suddenly appear on an aircraft radar screen many miles away. This development forced submarine crews to change their behavior. Surfacing at night had once been a reliable method for moving safely across the ocean. With radar-equipped aircraft patrolling the Atlantic, however, submarines could no longer assume that darkness would protect them. A radar contact could bring an aircraft directly overhead before the submarine crew had time to react. Submarines still attempted to avoid these threats by diving as quickly as possible once an aircraft was sighted. But aircraft attacks often happened with little warning. Patrol planes flying low across the ocean could appear suddenly above a submarine, leaving only seconds for the crew to submerge before bombs or depth charges were released. Even when submarines escaped direct damage, aircraft patrols disrupted their ability to operate effectively. Submarines forced to remain underwater for long periods, moved slowly, and had difficulty locating convoys. Communication between submarines also became more complicated, and reducing the effectiveness of coordinated wolfpack tactics. Gradually, the situation across the Atlantic began to shift. Submarines that once hunted convoys across open water were now being searched for by aircraft flying overhead. The balance of the campaign was beginning to move away from the submarines and toward the forces hunting them. As aircraft patrols became more common across the Atlantic, the overall balance of the submarine campaign began to change. Earlier in the war, submarines had operated with a high degree of freedom across large sections of the ocean. Convoys could be located, tracked, and attacked with relatively little interference from the air once they moved far enough from land. But as Allied air coverage expanded, those conditions slowly disappeared. Long-range patrol aircraft started covering areas that had previously been beyond the reach of air power. Escort carriers traveling with convoys added even more aircraft to the battle. Instead of relying only on land-based patrols, aircraft could now launch directly from ships in the middle of the ocean. These aircraft searched the surrounding waters constantly, scanning for submarines attempting to approach convoy routes. For submarines, this meant that approaching a convoy was becoming increasingly difficult. Aircraft could patrol ahead of the convoy and detect submarines before they were close enough to attack. Even if a submarine attempted to track a convoy from a distance, repeated aircraft patrols often forced it to dive and lose contact with its target. Every forced dive reduced the submarine's ability to move quickly or maintain a good attack position. Aircraft also played a key role in disrupting coordinated submarine tactics. Earlier in the war, submarines used radio communications to report convoy sightings and guide other submarines toward the target. These reports allowed multiple submarines to converge on the same convoy and launch attacks from different directions. But aircraft patrols increased the danger of transmitting radio messages, since Allied forces could sometimes detect and locate those transmissions. As a result, submarine commanders faced growing difficulties when trying to organize large wolfpack attacks. Convoys protected by aircraft were harder to approach, and submarines attempting to maintain contact with those convoys risked being detected from the air. Even when submarines managed to launch attacks, aircraft could quickly appear above the area and begin searching for the attackers. Convoys also began surviving Atlantic crossings with fewer losses than earlier in the war. While submarines still posed a threat, the presence of aircraft changed the dynamics of the battle. The submarines could no longer rely on the same advantages that had allowed them to dominate shipping lanes in previous years. The Atlantic was still vast, but the increasing presence of aircraft meant that large sections of ocean were no longer safe operating areas for submarines. The ocean itself had not changed, but the forces watching it had grown far more capable. By the later stages of the Atlantic campaign, The situation facing German submarines had changed dramatically from the early years of the war. What had once been an environment that favored submarine operations was gradually becoming far more dangerous. Aircraft patrols, improved detection equipment, and better coordination between air and naval forces were steadily reducing the advantages submarines had relied upon. Earlier in the conflict, submarine commanders believed the vastness of the Atlantic gave them the upper hand. The ocean was so large that it seemed impossible for Allied forces to monitor every section of water at the same time. Convoys crossing these routes had to travel long distances, and submarines could wait along those paths for opportunities to attack. But once aircraft began operating across much larger areas of the ocean, that assumption became far less reliable. Aircraft could now patrol regions that submarines once considered safe. Long-range patrol planes searched wide sections of ocean, while escort carrier aircraft monitored the waters surrounding convoys. Submarines traveling on the surface risked being spotted from the air, sometimes before their crews realized an aircraft was nearby. Once detected, submarines faced immediate danger from aerial attacks or from escort ships guided to their location. The growing presence of aircraft also changed how submarines were forced to operate. Instead of moving freely across the surface at night, submarine crews had to assume that aircraft might appear at any moment. Radar-equipped patrol planes could detect objects on the water even in darkness, removing one of the conditions submarines had once relied on for concealment. This forced submarines to spend more time submerged, where their speed and range were limited. Remaining underwater for extended periods made it harder for submarines to maintain contact with convoys or coordinate with other submarines. Battery power restricted how long they could stay submerged, and moving slowly beneath the surface reduced their ability to position themselves effectively for attacks. The tactics that had once allowed submarines to dominate large areas of the Atlantic became far more difficult to execute. The ocean itself had not become smaller, but the reach of Allied forces had expanded across it. No aircraft flying above the water could observe areas that had once been hidden from view. Convoys that previously crossed dangerous zones without air protection were now supported by aircraft searching the skies overhead. For submarine crews, the Atlantic was no longer the same battlefield it had once been. The vast ocean that had once concealed them was now being watched from the air, turning what had once been an advantage into a growing risk.